It is my pleasure to let you know that this is Maggie Bartley, Margaret Bartley. She's got a great resume. It's really, really long, so I'm not going to read all of it, but
Please don't.
she was a teacher in Maryland for over 25 years, history and geography. She's been town supervisor in Elizabethtown. She's very active in civic affairs. And here's the one, I keep learning new things about her. I've known her 5 years, maybe. She is a cellist and plays with the Adirondack Community Orchestra. So let's give a warm welcome to Maggie Bartley.
Okay, so we'll put that over there. Well, hello, folks. It's brave of you to get out here tonight, but the days are getting a little longer. I'm also a member of the Adirondack History Museum in Elizabethtown. I'm a trustee there, and I just am gravitated toward history. As a history teacher, I've just always loved history. So it's a real good opportunity for me to have fun. I mean, you know, I'm retired now, and people say, do you work? I said, I'm too busy. I don't have time because I'm too busy doing all the things that you don't get paid for. But several years ago, I thought about the Essex County Poorhouse, which in Essex County was referred to as the county home. And I think back in this summer, I did the same program at the Waylandsburg Grange. Now, the Waylandsburg Grange is just almost like down the street from the county home. So everybody there kind of knew where it was. But I don't know if you all know where the county home, aka the Poorhouse, is located. So you're shaking, no, you don't know where it is. Have you ever taken the ferry from Essex to Charlotte? If you've taken the ferry from Essex to Charlotte, you probably drove right past the county home. And it's a complex of brick buildings on the left-hand side as you're heading toward the ferry. Right now it's privately owned, but of course until about 1990s it was county and belonged to Essex County. So after you learn about it tonight, if you ever decide to take the ferry, just take a little extra few minutes. You should not go on the property. It is private property right now. Though I have snuck on there a few times when I needed to take some pictures. So a few years ago I decided I really think we need to preserve the history of this facility, and I thought about doing a program on the Poorhouse. And then I thought, who wants to hear about poverty? I mean, people come to the Adirondacks, it's beautiful, there's hiking, there's great food, there's trails. Do people really want to hear about poverty? I mean, and apparently so, because this is the third time I've given this program. So that surprised me that there is an audience for this. So, I remember the phrase my mother used to use. Every time one of 5 kids would say, I want a bike, I want, she'd go, you're driving me to the poorhouse. Did you ever hear that phrase? Yeah, I think a lot of older folks, because that meant you're spending too much money, and I'm not going to waste money on that. So I thought driven to the poorhouse is a really good phrase, but that really meant something in the past. And we'll get into how why it's driven to the poorhouse. And so really what we're looking at is poverty and politics in the Adirondacks. Now, some of these pictures are clearly not from the Adirondacks because nobody was wasting film and printing pictures about poverty. I mean, that's not a thing they wanted to document. So some of these are like, this is from their Library of Congress. And the thing I was struck by this picture is there's at least 2 babies in that picture. That mothers with infants and elderly people and disabled people, no, now I see 3, there's a little toddler there in the front, were just jammed into places like this, and it was really grim. So we really have to think about poverty, and most people, you know, it's a very negative, sad, gets very controversial with politics sometimes. But how do we deal with poverty? Because I found these 3 quotes that I thought were really interesting because people have been dealing with poverty and the question of poverty for a long time. Poverty is the parent of revolution and crime. So poverty creates crime. And we still hear that in the news too, right? People that are poor, that have little or nothing, or are living on the street, they're more likely, people say, they're criminals. The poor you will always have with you. Like, poverty is never going to go away. No matter what we do, there's always going to be some people that don't have what other people have. A nation's greatness is measured by how it treats its weakest members. And poverty is one of those things, whether it's caused by physical disability, mental disability, just lack of money. But does anybody recognize the authors of any of those quotes? Yeah, what do you say? Which one?
The second one, Jesus.
Jesus Christ. That was from the New Testament. Yep, good. Anybody? The other 2? The first one, poverty is the parent of revolution and crime, is Aristotle. Okay, that's 2,500 years ago. They had poverty problems, and he was, saying this is the cause of it. And the last one is Gandhi, measuring how a nation is based on how it treats its weakest members. So I thought, this is not a new problem. This is a very old problem. The United States, once it became a nation and was no longer a British colony, it had to come up with the structure it needed to deal with social issues. And we're still dealing with those social issues now. But in 1784 to 1824, laws were passed by the new Congress. But remember, it was states that did most of the work. The federal government in those days had very little power. So each state was almost like its own little kingdom. And New York passed some laws in Albany at the legislative level. In 1784, each town in New York was required to appoint an overseer of the poor. This is part of the local town structural government. So we had towns, and we still have towns in New York, which I find, having come from Maryland, really strange. There are 18 towns in Essex County. I came from Montgomery County, Maryland. The county is the smallest level of government. And that they have over 1 million people in Montgomery County, and they have one government. So anyway, 18 towns in Essex County, and then every other county had towns. So somebody had to be the overseer of the poor, and that was a state law. They didn't say what you had to do. They just said, somebody's got to be in charge of this. So every town, along with having a supervisor and town council and town clerk, had to have an overseer of the poor. Of course, it was always men. There were no women ever had public jobs in those days. The overseer was responsible for giving needed food, clothing, and medicine to poor families. That meant the overseer had to go get it somewhere, had to find it, had to get the food, had to get the medicine or get the clothing, and they had to keep a ledger book. And a few years ago at our Adirondack History Museum, we were given one of the overseer of the poor for Elizabethtown's ledger book. So you'll see some of that in this program. Basically, they would have to go buy the food, buy the clothes, buy the medicine, give it to the poor person, wherever they lived, and then they would give a bill. At the end of the year, they would have a tally, and the town would have to reimburse. Now, where's the town going to get the money to do the reimbursement? They had a poor tax. So every landowner had to pay a tax, like we pay property tax, and it had to cover the cost for caring for the poor people in their town. And notice it's their town. There was always that issue of that person from over in the next town who found out that, hey, maybe the food was a little better in this town. And no, we're not. And there was these boundaries and borders. Wait a minute, that sounds like today, doesn't it? Close the borders of Elizabethtown. Don't let North Elba let anybody in from Keene. Literally, it was our poor, not your poor. So that's what they were They were always fighting about who's poor are you? What town are you from? And your town really was responsible for you. Giving only minimal food and shelter to the needy was intentional. We don't want to attract people because we give better food than the town of, town of Bloomingdale, what is it, St. Armand's, or the town of Keene. So the idea was that if you give people more than they minimally need, they'll get lazy. And politicians and taxpayers believed good food, clothing, and housing would make a person lazy and unwilling to work. Why should they work if they can get that barrel of flour for the winter, So there was really the intent of not making it pleasant or good. And this applied to infants all the way up to the elderly, the people that were crippled, the people that were, disabled. The idea was don't make it too good and don't attract others. Okay, so the overseer of the poor, here he is in some of the cartooning of the day. A hard-hearted man, the poor are flying at the sight of you. Their faint hearts bleed, you callous wretch. You are denying the mercy you will sometime need. Okay, because I once heard a great quote from somebody. We are only temporarily abled. We will all eventually be disabled, whether it's age or accidents or illness. So they always show the overseer and the people with money as being fat, because fat meant you were rich. So is he really hard-hearted? Is he a mean, real bastard? Or is he what the people needed at the time? And this cartoon on the right here shows these guys in here eating lots and lots of food, jamming food in their mouths. He's an overweight guy. And here's the poor person outside begging, and this guy's keeping him out. So the poor could see the food or see how people, if you were fat, it meant you were rich. That was considered to be a good thing. So the overseer, had this task, and these were not lifetime positions. They often changed every year or two because people just said, I'm not doing that again. It's your turn. In the first decades of the 1800s, the 19th century, town poorhouses sheltered adults and children together. There was no difference. There was no segregation by sex or by age. The overseer would drop off food at people's homes if they had a home. Like if they had a cabin and maybe they were sick or maybe they were crippled, he would drop off food. But sometimes the people didn't have a home. So people of all ages and genders were housed together. And what the overseer would do was they would rent an empty house. So the poorhouse wasn't always the same building. Somebody had to have a building that they could basically put anybody in, and then they would drop off a barrel of flour or a box of whatever, and all the people just lived together. Whether they were mentally or physically disabled, it was just all jammed in there. And it was up to the overseer to pay the rent. They did not want to buy a building. They did not own land. So the overseer, the town did not do that. They were not going to make it a place where that was permanent. These were always very temporary situations, and often temporary only for the winter, because somebody could work, if they were able to work, could go and work on a farm, and they would live in the barn or in the loft above the house or something, the farm laborers, and they could work from like April to October till harvest, but there was no place for them to go in the winter. So these were often very temporary places that were just leased by the town. Disabled persons or orphans were placed often with a local family. And in looking at the census records, which are online through Ancestry.com, if you've ever done genealogy, you can look at the old census records. Many, many families had a person living with them, and the relationship was listed as boarder. That means they took somebody in, and they were getting paid by the town So if you had a 3-year-old or or a widow, instead of putting them in the house with all these other people, they would just say, we'll pay you if you take this person. So I thought this was a pretty good example of a family. And I tried to count the number of people in this picture. Most of the homes in those days were 1 or 2 rooms, maybe a loft that was very low so that the children would sleep in the loft. So I believe there are 10 people in this picture. And you can see what's going on. There's a number of small children and screaming and yelling. And I think the little fellow here is urinating in a bucket. There's an older person here clearly sleeping. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 children and at least 3 adults. Probably 2 or 3 or 4 of them were boarders. They didn't get their own room. Everybody's sleeping in the same place or in the loft above the house. So it was very noisy, and it was, no plumbing. Outside relief was basically what we would call public assistance now. Was given seasonally to poor families so they could stay in their homes. So you really didn't want to have to take people and move them someplace. A barrel of oats, a barrel of flour, barrel of cornmeal. The overseer of the poor would take that to a family, and that would be their food for several months. Now, they could have had a garden. They could go out and shoot squirrels or trap animals, eat rabbits, ice fish. But that way the family could stay together in their own home, but they needed that food or they would have starved to death over the winter. This is an example of a family. The reason I put them up there, Nelson Goff and Chester Goff. That's father is Nelson. That's his oldest son, Chester. This happens to be my husband's great-grandfather from Lewis. When the Civil War began, Nelson and his oldest son enlisted and went to war. That left his wife and Chester went, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 small children. He was gone for 2 years. There was no man there that could cut wood and plow. And so she and the children stayed at their cabin, their house, which is still there and still belongs to the Goff family in Lewis. And they had a garden, and they fished, and they grew things. But in the winter, they couldn't do it. And she took those young children and moved into the county poorhouse during the Civil War period, and then in the spring went back to her farm. So it was that transient kind of thing where there was no way she could keep those children alive without at least able-bodied men in the family to help. The overseer of the poor in Elizabethtown, one of them was Walter Marvin. And this is his 1856 logbook that we were given at the museum. So you'll see, on December 8th, it's winter, of 56, 2 bushels of corn for Henry Mayo, and then there was some pork, Miller, and supplies. C.N. Williams is a drugstore. So he's basically purchasing items. He also has up there some rice. That he's purchasing this, he's keeping check on it, and he will turn his bill in. And then later on, he has in the summer, keeping Englishmen overnight. So there was a transient who came through. He gave the man 2 meals and then sent him on his way, and he charged the town 63 cents for feeding that man. That was 2 meals. I thought this was interesting. October 28th, to keeping, which means he took somebody in, George Shepard, a colored man, overnight and 4 meals, charged the town $1. It turns out, and then he gave this man, Shepard, $1 in cash to help him home to Vermont with his friends. So I thought that was very kind of him that this was a man, I don't know how this man got there, and he needed help, and they got him back to Vermont. They weren't going to keep him, but they actually built the town. Otherwise, Mr. Shepherd might have just lived in their town. So I don't know if it was racism to say they wanted him back in Vermont. Here, take $1, go, But this is the kind of records he had to keep. This was another very sad story of Elizabethtown. He's buying rice and sugar for a family, 1 box of pills for Horace Durand. Horace Durand had tuberculosis. He died. His wife took care of him. They had 2 small children. His wife died of tuberculosis, which was contagious. And they left behind a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. We don't know what happened to the 1-year-old. The little 3-year-old girl became the responsibility of the overseer of the poor. He had to find a home to put her in as a boarder, which he did. And it was $1 a week the town had to pay to keep this little girl, to keep her fed and keep her clothed. But one time, she grew, she got a little bigger, and she didn't have any shoes, so he had to go buy her a pair of shoes. Now, this is the overseer. A coffin for Joe Larson. So Joe died at home, and the overseer of the poor had to pay for the coffin to get him out of there. Digging the grave, $2. And there's a pair of boots and shoes for Cornelia Durand. That's the little girl. He had to buy her a pair of shoes. It was $1. And he bought them from W.W. Root. That was the store in Elizabethtown. So I was really intrigued by Cornelia Durand, the little girl who's the only survivor of that family. And I went on Ancestry.com, did a little research, found out that when she was a teenager, she ran away from the place she had been living because they made her do all the work. She was like a slave, practically. And she ran away, and she ran away to where her aunt lived in St. Lawrence County, and they took her out to like Kansas, and she ended up growing up, getting married in Kansas and having a family and descendants today. And when I looked at the person who had done this research, I said, oh my God, I can tell you what happened to Cornelia. And we have this record of that little girl escaping from being a boarder in one of these houses. But I thought that was interesting, and of course the family still exists. A poor homeless child would be assigned to the lowest bidder. Someone would say, I can take care of a child for $1 a week. Then somebody would say, I'll do it for 75 cents a week. And so the low bidder would get the kid. Not exactly good for the child, is it? There were no requirements for clothes or how warm the barn must be, because sometimes the children had to sleep in the barn because there just wasn't room in the house. So you took in a kid for 75 cents a week and they slept in the barn. Again, more of his, it says, commence to keeping Cornelia Durand, and he's keeping track of her and these other people. This was a really interesting one here. Use of horse and sleigh, 75 cents. If he had to go in the winter to pick up a person and either deliver them to their new shelter, whoever's going to take them, or take them to the poorhouse, he billed 75 cents going and 75 cents coming back. And that was his sleigh, and he billed for that. So then as poverty and time went by, people started moving around. And is it our town, poor person, or is it the county? Because the county is a municipality, and there were people that maybe they came over and worked in North Elba in the summer, and then maybe they went back to Elizabethtown in the winter, where maybe they had friends or family, or maybe they went to another town. And no town wanted to take somebody else's poor. So they started realizing, sometimes it's kind of hard to tell where they're from. So they really need a place to put anybody. And that's where, in 1824, New York passed a law called the Poorhouse Act, requiring each county to erect one or more poorhouses to care for the worthy poor. Because there was worthy poor and there was unworthy poor. And so you had to be really good if you're poor to get help. Because if you're not good, they're not going to help you. So there was always this arguing back and forth. Okay, who was responsible in the end? The people of the state of New York, the Board of Supervisors of Essex County, by a vote in favor to restore the distinction between county poor and town poor. They were always fighting. This was a huge fight between the town governments and the county governments. And that's the county courthouse, which is still there. If you've been to Elizabethtown, this is where they hold their Board of Supervisors meetings, the county treasurer. So it was up to the Board of Supervisors, which is the representatives from each town that make up that county government. And again, every town supervisor is elected by the people in their town. Nobody's elected county-wide to be on that board. So I was once one of those people. I was a town supervisor. And I learned very quickly that the county is where you get stuff for your town. And you want things, you go to the county. And then you just vote to give them to yourself, you know. But we still have that kind of government, which I find to be very archaic. Okay, worthy poor people. Old people, sick people, handicapped, which, by the way, comes from the word, and you'll notice the young fellow on the right, he has his hat in his hand. When you take your hat off and you hold it out, people would put money or food in your hat. That's where the word handicapped comes from, because the cap is in your hand. So the term handicapped is from begging. Anybody who is disabled, here's a boy and a man, both have lost their leg. It's amazing they survived. Idiotic, so that was obviously their word for mentally ill, or people who were, I have a niece who's 34 years old, but she's about 5 mentally. Crippled was pretty common because of all the accidents, particularly in logging and mining. Deaf mute, which often comes from people having illnesses as a child. Think of Helen Keller. You know, she was deaf, mute, and blind. Feeble simply means you're weak and old, and blind. So these people are worthy poor. We should help them. I mean, that kind of goes back to their religion, people's religion. You're supposed to help. Then there's the unworthy poor. You don't want to help them. You don't want to spend your tax dollars on that. You're a thief, a harlot, a bastard, which means nobody knew who your father was, a sinner, they didn't go to church, a drunk, a liar, someone who was lazy, or someone who was severely mentally ill, not just disabled mentally, but severely. And those people, nobody wanted them around. Nobody wanted to spend any money on them. They should just go away and die. And as you see here, there was a lot of children who, there was no birth control. So people got pregnant, and women got pregnant, and they had children, and they're begging. The idea of a poorhouse came from England. Towns were expected to care for their poor, but there was a distinction. The disabled and elderly and able-bodied persons were expected to work. So if you're in the poorhouse and you are physically able to do anything, they will put you to work. That's part of what you do to pay for the care you're getting. So I thought this was an interesting painting. It's basically elderly women. And that's, people, a lot of times people couldn't work at all. They weren't not capable. And you think about the nursing homes we have today. My mother's going to be 101 in June. I don't think you could ask her to do any work. So the idea of, if you're not good with money, people that gambled, people that drank, people that were thieves, that they would end up in the poorhouse. And every county had one in New York, and every state started doing it at this, and usually, I have to say this, it's a lot of women with small children. Men could work. If a man could do any kind of labor, he could work. And he could live, on a farm or in a mining area. But it was the women with small children that really took the brunt of this. Okay, now we're going to try something here. Do you know how to turn that mic on? It's on? Okay. Let's see if we can make this work.
Oh, how can it be they have driven their father so helpless and oh God, may their crimes be forgiven, to perish out here in the cold. Oh heaven, I'm sad and I'm weary. See the tears how they course down my cheek. This world is so lonely and weary. My heart for relief faintly sees. I'm old, I'm helpless and feeble, and the days of my youth have gone by. And over the hills to the poorhouse, I must wander along there to die.
Just a little piece of music about that. And you notice they're talking about their father so helpless and old, and the crime of putting him in the poorhouse. That's what people did. That's what was available. Okay, in those days there was no understanding of nutrition, and the food served in poorhouses often caused sicknesses and illnesses and diseases. And I think about my mother. And I used to say to her, and maybe you all can remember talking to parents or grandparents, what did you eat when you were a kid for breakfast? She goes, mush, cornmeal mush. I'd say, what else? She'd go, well, there'd be some bacon grease. And I'd say, anything else? She goes, well, we had meat on Sunday. But the rest of the week she said, we had collard greens. She was from Virginia. Beans. But cornmeal mush, she called it, for breakfast every day. And for lunch, she would take to school a biscuit, sometimes with lard on it. So not exactly nutritious, right? Being thin was a sign of laziness and poverty, while being fat was a sign of wealth and success. This belief carried well into the 20th century. It only once people began, really in the 1930s during the Depression, where you started having the federal programs for nutrition and getting people to eat differently, cook differently, and have, now of course we know about vitamins, and they didn't know about any of that. But the poorhouses were really designed to punish people, to make it so bad that you would go to work if you could. Now, this is where the Essex County poorhouse is located. This is an old map. Essex County bought 100 acres of land in Waylandsburg, which is where the Waylandsburg Grange is, on the way to the Essex Ferry. And the first building was erected in 1844. Interestingly, they built the buildings out of brick, which for those days meant they were more fire resistant, because wooden buildings just burned so easily. And Waylandsburg is there, and so this is where the Grange Hall is, if you've ever been there. And here's the county home, and over here is Wadhams. So you're going down Route 22, and there's the county home on that side. Okay, so every year at the end of the year, the county would want an accounting from the poorhouse. They would appoint, they built the building, they appointed somebody to run it, and they would want a list of everybody who was there, and how many weeks they were there, and how much it cost to run that county home. So it says there, first Paid supplies, you could see that the amount of money they're spending for the entire year was, I guess, at the total $1,700 for the entire year. And then expenses for relief, those are the people that get the food taken to their home. So here's an early picture of the county poorhouse. The main building is this one right here with the porch in the front. These buildings are all still standing. This picture's probably taken around 1920s. And there really were no pictures of it I could find earlier than that. Okay, the Essex County, I think I might have made a copy of this. There were some documents out front, yeah. Anyway, the number of persons in 1856 was 66 people in the county poorhouse, 36 females and 30 males. So there's definitely more women, and they're probably younger women. 9 females under the age of 10 and 14 under the age of males under the age of 10. So there's at least almost over 20 small children there. Paupers during the year would drop in and leave, so it wasn't permanent. And number of infants born in the poorhouse, 4. Now think about that. Maybe a woman came in pregnant. Maybe she'd been there a while and somehow she got pregnant. But they were delivering babies there. 8 people had died that year. Bound out to work. That's where they took older children, usually teenagers, and they would basically rent them out to local farmers as labor. Now, the kids that did the work didn't get the money. The county got the money. So that was basically a form of slavery. But bound out mean they were given shelter and food and some clothing by the farmer who hired and paid the county for that work. Discharged 64, that's probably the people like the Mrs. Goff and her small children who came in and then left. Absconded, escaped. I'm thinking those are young ones, escaped. The children of the poorhouse over the age of 5 and under 16 have been instructed for 5 months, and the whole number of children taught. So they had a teacher. They would bring a teacher out for a period of time to try to at least get these kids to understand reading, writing, and arithmetic. It wasn't really much other than that. Okay, and then in 1875, the state passed a law that you had to have information about every person that came in to the poorhouse. So this is the increase of bureaucracy. And so every person who came to the poorhouse had to have this kind of form. And what's fascinating is, here's Rosa Bashaw. She's 24 years old. She's married. She was originally from Clinton County, and now she's in Essex. Oh, no. And then it asks, if you go down through here, where her parents were, education, none. Habits of the father, temperate. Habits of the mother, intemperate. So I'm guessing mom was a drunk and dad was not. And then they want to know, does she have an occupation, housekeeping, labor? The father was a laborer. And grandparents. They even ask about the grandparents. They don't know. Nobody knows about the grandparents. And down it says, existing cause of dependence, does not know how to do any work and is pregnant. Okay. Now, has this person received public relief? If so, for how long? 12 years she's been taken care of by the state. She's 24 now, and she's pregnant. I wonder where that came from. The family have had help from time to time. The father died 12 years ago. What is the probability of this person's recovery? Will be able to care for herself as soon as the child is born. I mean, Is that a sad situation? I mean, but this is just, everybody had these forms filled out. They also had to figure out how to classify people that had disabilities. Guidebook for classifying those people in a poorhouse. So you could see, depending on how they looked, that's back in the days when they thought they would measure your skull and they would see if the shape of your skull determined whether you were mentally ill or not. But they had these diagnoses: imbecile, idiot, melancholia, that would be maybe depression or schizophrenia. And so they based it on how you looked, whether you looked like you were crazy or not. And here's some more. Oh, these are criminally insane people. This is how they look. So, I mean, can you imagine being judged by, oh, you look like that? It's really pretty sad. So, back to the poorhouse. They finally changed the name in the late 19th century to county home, thinking it made it sound a little better. And the county operated it as a farm, and they produced their own food. They had cows, they had chickens, they grew, so that there was less of a financial burden on the county taxpayers if the people that were there could produce food. They had a little problem for a long time. They just didn't have any water. There was a river nearby. So finally, around 1900, they made a pond and trapped some water from a creek and then piped it into the poorhouse. But prior to that time, it was all probably picked up with buckets out of the river. These are some of the pictures of more recent taken pictures of the poorhouse as it looks now, because it has not been operated as a poorhouse since the 1980s. The county eventually sold it, but in 1879, a reporter from the New York Herald decided to visit Essex County's poorhouse. There's this really amazing Herald front page article, and I'm going to read you a little of it. It's called "Misery Among the Forsaken Poor of Essex County, Defying the State Laws, Children Growing Up in a School of Pauperism, and the Persecution of a Madman." This is what the reporter started it. He said, "I have no hesitation in saying that the Essex County almshouse at this place is decidedly the worst in the state of New York. I doubt if there are any as bad as this, except perhaps Jacksonville and Tompkins County. But nowhere have I seen such an exhibition of inhumanity and lack of care. The buildings are situated a half a mile from a village. The inmates, which seem literally on their way to a pauper's purgatory. There was one poor fellow who was chained to the floor." And this went on for the entire front page of the Herald. The Board of Supervisors got really upset because none of them had ever visited the poorhouse, because who wants to go there? And so they assigned a committee of supervisors from Elizabethtown to go out and see if it really was that bad. And they came back and said, actually, it's really nice there. It's not bad at all. And the guy's doing a great job running it, and it doesn't cost us much money. So conflict of government saying one thing, and the Herald was a bit of a rag newspaper. It was kind of, like the National Enquirer or something. Anyway, in 1882, this was the report given by the Board of Supervisors, and it said, "Your committee on the county poorhouse reports they met at the county and carefully examined the buildings. They found a marked improvement in the class of dependent inmates therein." And they go on and tell about, it's pretty nice, it's pretty good. And there's the people that made that report. So time goes by. Starting in the early 20th century, there was a decision to remove children from the poorhouse. And anybody under the age of 16 was removed and put into orphanages. And some of those orphanages were mostly downstate. They also, the state of New York, opened a mental hospital in Ogdensburg, St. Lawrence County. So if somebody had severe mental illness, they were taken to Ogdensburg and they were not in the poorhouse. So they started really subdividing who was allowed to live there and to keep the children away from the older people. And they also started segregating the women from the men. I think that probably helped solve the pregnancy problem. But from the time they started segregating men and women, they were segregated all the way up through the 1960s. So the men would eat with the men and the women would eat with the women, and they had different buildings. They could interact outside doing agricultural stuff, but they were kept very segregated in that manner. Every superintendent of the poor hereafter elected for the county of Essex shall, by the virtue of his office, be the keeper of the poorhouse. So you had to have a county superintendent of the poor, and that person had to reside at the poorhouse. They couldn't operate it from afar. So they took the main building and made it into like an apartment so that the supervisor of the poorhouse and his wife, who would be the head of the kitchen, and their children would live there on the property. There was a woman I met, Vicki Dickinson, who was one of those children that grew up there in the 1950s. And she said it was a wonderful place to live. Her family lived there with all the people. She knew everybody there. But that's mid-20th century. This is the apartment and how it looked, where this section of the building went to the person who ran the property. And these pictures came from Vicki, who had a photo album of the entire complex. And so I'm just going to go through some of these so you could see. The 19th century was a pretty dark, awful place. The 20th century, things started to improve. This building right here is the infirmary, where if someone was ill, they had a nursing station there. People that had any kind of health issues went there. The labor of the residents was part of the operation, and it helped cut the cost, particularly of growing the food. And they also had shops where they made things. Kind of like we still have that with Mountain Lake Services. We have weavers, we have carpenters, people that make pottery. So there was some of that too that could be sold. Water was a problem, as I mentioned, until they purchased land to build a pond so they could actually have water pressure and water coming into the building. How 20th century, they put a fire escape in. That was a requirement. And the residents worked in the barns and dairies. This is all 1940s, 50s, early 60s. And Vicki had pictures of some of the people that lived there at that time. And as you can see, they're harvesting apples. They've got a dairy farm there. She knew all these. When we did this at the museum, she knew their names, and that was really fun to hear that. There was a fire in one of the buildings, as you can see, and that was in the early 50s. I don't know what the cause of the fire was, but they did. The building is still there, and it was repaired. You can see the infirmary, and you can see the hospital beds. All the furnishings were auctioned off when it was closed, and there are people around that have those beds. They became quite popular. These are just life at the county home in the mid-20th century. This is the Dr. Goff. Dr. Goff was from the town of Keene, and he was also the medical doctor for Essex County, the health inspector. So he would go out weekly, and they had some nurses there, but he would go out and help. So there is marked improvement into the 20th century from what had been in the past. That's one of the nurses. Answering the dinner bell, she said all the men came out of their dormitory and went to the men's dining room. October 1960. Thanks to a couple, county inmates have bear steak. Bear steaks were on the menu in Essex County Poorhouse thanks to a honeymooning couple. The newlywed was traveling to Montreal when their automobile struck a 200-pound black bear. Game wardens took the carcass to the poorhouse. Okay, roadkill was still on the menu in 1960. I've never heard of anybody eating a bear steak. This is the kitchen at that time. And by then there were some health department, regulations. There's the men's dining room. In 1968, the county decided to build a nursing home because by then all of the people at the county poorhouse were elderly seniors. There were no more children, young people. There were no more, anybody that had severe medical problems was in another institution. So Essex County decided to build the, what they called the Horace Nye Home, which is now the Essex Center in Elizabethtown. Horace Nye was one of the last people that ran the county home, so they named the new nursing home after him. And the last people from the county home were moved, they listed them on the paper, moved to Elizabethtown. So that left the property empty. There's still a driveway, and I just still called County Home Way, the road that goes into the property. And this is the way it kind of looks now. It was bought in the 1990s. The county had it. They didn't know what to do with it. They tried to sell it, but nobody wanted it. And it sat there empty for a long time, not kind of falling apart. And in, I think, the late 90s, 99, it was purchased, or around 2000, by a private individual who had a nonprofit. I have not seen anything else happen there. And if you go by, it looks pretty disheveled, and nothing seems to be going on there. They have some really great fruit trees there. They have peaches. They're so close to Lake Champlain. We call it the banana belt because it's warm enough for peaches to grow, and those are peach trees. But these are the buildings that are left from the county home. Now, if you go to the ferry through Waylandsburg, this is the road, Route 22, and for a long time, this is an old Google Maps. On the left, you just see this open area that's grass. It doesn't look like that anymore. This is the cemetery for the poorhouse. So starting in the late 1870s, they started burying people across the street in this wide open space across from the buildings. There's no headstones there. There are a few veterans there that have veterans flat markers. So today, it looks like this. It's mowed, the county, well, there's a very interesting story. This property went with the sale to the private nonprofit, but they didn't take care of it. And then, ironically, it turned out that you can't sell a cemetery. It's illegal to sell a cemetery. The county, Essex County, had sold that cemetery with the property where the buildings were across the street, but you can't. So a lawsuit was brought, and the county had to take back the cemetery. So the county is responsible for that cemetery. And they mow it. A couple times a year, it gets mowed. There's a marker put up there. They've started to list the names of the people that they know are buried there. They don't know everybody's name. So that is now county-owned property. So the burials there go from 1874 to 1976. Some of the people that died in the Horace Nye Nursing Home were buried there. They were still using it as a burial plot. So it's there. And we have some Civil War veterans there. The American Legion has put up markers on some of the military. And every year on Memorial Day, they go out and put the flags up on those soldiers' graves. These are people that served in the military and died there at the county home. This is a drone shot. Do you see the graves? That's how they're buried. That close. That's how many there are. When I saw that, that was actually from Google Earth, I was like, oh my gosh, they're just lined up there. It's a little creepy, isn't it? To see them from the above. This is from the Board of Supervisors notes from December of 1882. Also that the plot of ground south of the barns, used as a burial ground, be enclosed by a cheap fence, and a new site selected for the burials on some other portion of the county farm as may be adapted for such purposes. Now, what does that mean? It means there's another cemetery in there, the one that predates 1880. And it said it was south of the barns. This is the buildings that are there still. The barns, you can see the footprint from the barns that were here. They're gone now. I think down in here is the first cemetery. It's not marked, but I found that document and I thought, yeah. There was a lot of people between the 1830s and the 1880s that died there. The future of the county home. The Essex County Board of Supervisors did a study, hired somebody to do a study on its potential use. This is 1980. It took them another 20 years before they could sell it, and nothing has happened to the property since then. So there's a lot of people who have ideas. They think it should be made into like affordable housing, maybe apartments, maybe a retirement community, like the Willsboro School became senior housing. I don't know what's going to happen to the county home, but it's still there. And that's it. Questions or quiz or something?
No, they're going to ask you.
Oh, they're going to ask me. Okay. This fellow has his hand up.
What happened to the New York State legislative requirement to look after the poor? The obligation to provide.
That they argued over this back and forth. I've seen they had to pass a law to do this, and then they wouldn't. The locals wouldn't do it. They just wouldn't know better. You know, part of it was the cost. You know, what the state said that they had to do versus what the people were willing to pay taxes for didn't match up. And there was no enforcement.
So did the legislation just lapse into, does it have any current standing, or is it just seen as
Well,
being?
now all of the nursing homes are, we don't have county courthouses. They're all privately operated, like the Essex Center bought the Horace Nye home, which was a county-owned nursing home until 2013. And the county sold it to a private operator, in part because the county was not really, they didn't know how to run a nursing home. They knew how to run a government, but they didn't know how to run a nursing home. And they were hemorrhaging money. I became a town supervisor in 2012, and I was told, I was on the committee that had to go interview the buyers. And we had different companies that wanted to buy it, so we had to go interview them. But basically, they were hemorrhaging several $1 million a year on that nursing home. They could not make it pay for itself. So it became private. So I think most county-owned nursing homes have gone private because it's just, the people that bought it owned like 25 nursing homes. So they would order, as one of the guys said, when we order adult diapers, we order them by like a boatload. I mean, enormous quantities they buy when you have 25 nursing homes. You know, you buy everything at scale. The county couldn't do that. So that's, right. We don't have it. Anything else you want to know?
Other questions?
Anybody want to drive past it? Not right now. But it's worth it for the ferry ride. Yeah, yeah.
So in the early 1990s, in the early 1990s, I chaperoned a elementary school trip to the county home, and I just remember it as being a farm. The idea was it was a farm visit.
Yeah.
What was going on with it then?
I wasn't here then, so I don't know, but I do know that it took quite a time before the county was able to find a buyer. I do know that some of the land behind those buildings was leased to like farmers that are in that area, because if you go down County Home Road, that all that land behind those buildings is under agricultural, you know, they're growing hay and corn, animal feed. So I think the county, you know, said, well, you know, somebody might as well use it and we'll lease it. So I think until that buyer came along, and the guy was part of a nonprofit, I just haven't seen anything since then that has happened there.
Do you know anything about the little train station across the street on the tracks there? Was that part of the county home?
It was not part of the county home, but there was a railroad, of course, that went all the way from Plattsburgh, Montreal, right down along the lake shore, which still does. And that was because we had the county home there, there was a lot of people that would come in and out using that railroad station, which is now, it was up for sale recently. Because there's very little in the way of, passenger travel anymore on the train. And of course, Amtrak, every time you try to, it was always stopped. It wasn't running. I think sometimes it runs once a day. But in the early 20th century, even back as far as the Civil War, and this, I find this really interesting. During the Civil War, you could mail a letter in Westport, and it would be in Washington, D.C. the next day, because the trains were going 4 and 5 times a day from Plattsburgh to Albany to Washington, D.C., and they were shipping all the soldiers down. They had faster mail under Lincoln than we have now, because the trains were just running all the time. Make you... Anything else? No. Oh, here's one.
Yes, I'm happy to do it. I actually studied the British poor law, and I wonder, did you see any, not necessarily conversation, but reflection of the people in New York looking at what was going on in Britain? Obviously, they'd inherited their ideas about poverty and the poor law from Britain. And I'm wondering if the people in Essex or in New York were kind of looking outside to say, whoa, what are other people doing? Or were they just looking kind of to themselves?
I think they're pretty insular, because everybody was protecting their own turf, and nobody wanted to pay the poor tax, which the idea of, and we still have that attitude of, should people get free food stamps, free school lunches? Why should we feed children? I actually heard somebody recently say, well, maybe if the kids went hungry, they'd realize they need to work harder. And I'm like, I'm not, this is 2025, but there's still some people that feel that, why should people have things that are good? Better to give them things that are bad so they'll work harder? Yeah, there's still some of that around. Yeah, so, yeah.
Was it just a Christian thing that being a bastard was such a sin?
I think many religions feel that way. only because I used to teach comparative world religions in a public school, so, yeah. And it really, I tell you what being the bastard thing is, it's all about inheritance. Because the bastards don't get to inherit the land, the crops, the animals, the horses. You have to know who's going to get the stuff. And it's not really a religious thing, it's an economic thing, and the real children don't want to have to share it with the other children that dad made. And it's all about money. Okay, well, we've had a good time. What do you think?
Thank you very much.